They begged me not to share this. They begged me not to say this out loud. Not because it is dangerous, but because it is true. Because once you hear it, you will never unsee it. And when you act on it, everything about women will change. Not just how they treat you, but how they look at you, how they chase you, how they fear losing you. See, there's something women never wanted men to figure out. A hidden emotional code. A psychological blueprint that keeps them in control. Keeps you doubting your worth, chasing their validation, and mistaking their silence for love. But once a man wakes up, once he learns the one thing that flips the emotional script, women panic because they know once you reclaim your power, you become unreachable. No more chasing, no more begging, no more asking. What did I do wrong? You'll finally see her behavior for what it really is. Not affection, not loyalty, but control dressed as connection. And the second you stop reacting to her games, the moment you stop giving her what she used to manipulate you with, that's when she realizes you are not the same man. Lesson 1, she doesn't want perfect. She wants presence anymore. You're colder, calmer, more focused. You've stopped explaining and started disappearing. And that silence, it terrifies her because now she's not in control. You are. This is the shift they never wanted you to make. Because once men understand this, women cannot play the game the same way again, and they know it. Let's talk about what this really is, and why once you know, she'll never be able to treat you the same again. The biggest mistake men make today is thinking they have to be perfect to be loved, that they have to have it all together. The right words, the right job, the right body, the perfect energy just to be seen. But let me break that lie today, because women are not looking for your perfection. They're searching sometimes without even knowing it for something far more rare, your presence. See, presence is not about doing the most. It's not about constant texting, planning romantic dates every week, or bending over backwards to make her smile. That might feel like love to you. That might feel like effort. But to her, it is noise. Because if your spirit is not there, if your attention is not anchored, she does not feel you. She only sees what you are trying to prove. And women are masters at sensing emotional absence. You could be sitting right beside her, saying all the right things. But if your mind is chasing her approval, if your heart is secretly begging for her validation, she feels it. She might not say it, but her body knows, her intuition knows. And that's when she starts to pull away. Not because she's confused, but because something in her whispers. He does not see himself yet. Presence is when you are here emotionally. Not scrambling to win her, but simply being. Being calm, being rooted, being enough. It's when you look at her with clarity, not fear. When you listen with intention, not anxiety. When you can sit in silence without trying to fill the space to keep her interested because you are already at peace with yourself. The truth is, a man who is present becomes unforgettable. He's not flashy, but he's felt. He does not flood her phone with texts, but his absence echoes. He does not compete with other men because there is no competition when a man knows who he is. And when a woman encounters that kind of man, one who does not chase, one who does not over-explain, one who does not need her affection to validate his existence, she feels something different. She feels safe, she feels challenged, she feels alive because your presence, not your perfection, awakens her feminine energy. It invites her to relax, to open, to trust. It tells her, you do not have to perform here. You're not being judged, I see you and I'm here. And in that moment, she softens not because of what you did, but because of who you are. But most men never get there. They're too busy performing. They're too busy proving. And in the process, they lose the very thing that would have made her stay. Their peace, their stillness, their presence. So, I'm telling you this not as a strategy to get her to like you. I'm telling you this so you can remember that you were never meant to perform for love. You were meant to embody it. And once you do that, once you stop trying to be perfect and start showing up present, she'll feel you and she'll never forget you. Let's talk about energy, not the kind that shows up in loud gestures or flashy outfits. I'm talking about the quiet, invisible energy that walks into a room before you do. The kind that tells a woman everything she needs to know about you without you saying a single word. Because whether you realize it or not, your energy is always teaching people how to treat you. Especially women. You cannot fake it. You cannot perform your way out of it. You are what you carry. And when your energy is needy, unsure, doubting, always is trying to please, she feels it. She may not call it out directly, but she'll react. She'll test your boundaries. She'll take a little more than she gives. She'll push to see how far you will bend. And if you bend too, lesson 2, your energy teaches her how to treat you far. If you keep shrinking yourself to make her comfortable, to avoid rocking the boat, to keep her around, she loses respect. She may not even know why, but something in her just stops trusting you. Because a man who does not honor himself cannot be trusted to honor her. Your energy is your frame. It's the emotional boundary you carry into every interaction. And when you walk in your worth, when you show up clear on what you will and will not tolerate, not just in your words, but in your spirit, you immediately change the dynamic. Suddenly, she's not in control. She's not testing you to see how much power she has. She's looking to see if she's worthy of your space. She starts adjusting herself to fit your standards. But most men do not believe they have that power. They give it away through over-apologizing, through silence in the face of disrespect, through chasing women who barely text back, through tolerating mood swings, manipulation, coldness just to avoid being alone. And the longer you allow that behavior, the more you train her to believe it is okay, that she can take without giving, that she can hurt without consequence, that you will always be there no matter how she shows up. But here's the hard truth. A woman cannot love a man she does not respect. And she cannot respect a man who cannot protect his energy, not protect her. Protect himself, his peace, his mission, his standards, his emotions. When a woman feels that you are emotionally solid, that you do not need her chaos to feel alive, that you can say no with a soft voice and walk away without drama, she takes notice. Her feminine energy either rises to match yours or she falls away, and either one is a win for you because you are no longer available to be emotionally manipulated just to feel wanted. Your energy is your armor. It tells her, you do not get to throw your moods at me like weapons. You do not get to earn intimacy without effort. I do not just give, I require. And when you walk in that kind of energy, you stop teaching women to use you and start teaching them to value you. There's a moment in every man's life when he has to stop explaining himself. Stop trying to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding him. Stop fighting to prove his heart, his intentions, his loyalty, especially to a woman who already decided she could treat him carelessly and he'd still stay. That moment is sacred. It's the beginning of a man's transformation. Because the truth is, women hear you the first time. When you say you love her, when you say you are hurt, when you say you need her to show up differently, she hears it, she understands it. But if she does not respect you, if she does not fear losing you, she does not respond to it. So, what do most men do? They repeat themselves. They explain more, they write paragraphs, send long messages, pour out their hearts in voice notes trying to make her see what they are feeling. But that only makes her colder, more distant, more confident that she still has power over your emotions. Because the more you explain, the more she learns how far you are willing to go for someone who's not even meeting you halfway. And you think being vulnerable will save the relationship. But it is not vulnerability if it is not respected. It's self-abandonment. So here's the shift. Stop explaining. Start disappearing. Not as a strategy to manipulate her, but as an act of self-respect. If she does not respond to your needs, your truth, your love, you do not yell. You exit quietly, fully, without drama, without warning, with dignity. There's something terrifying about a man who disappears in silence. Not because he's angry, but because he's done. He does not need to prove anything anymore. He's not trying to fix it. He's not chasing closure. He's simply honoring his soul. And that silence, it echoes, it lingers, it hits her at 2 a.m. When she checks your profile and sees that you have moved on. It hits her when she realizes you did not block her. You just stopped caring, you became unavailable. And that unavailability is not about pettiness, it's about alignment. You're not walking away from love, you're walking away from disrespect, from confusion, from emotional poverty. You're not abandoning lesson 3, stop explaining. Start disappearing. Her, you're choosing you. And when you do that, you shift the emotional balance, you stop being the man who begged and become the man she regrets losing. But here's the thing. By then, it is too late. You're already gone. you're already healing. You're already building a life so full she no longer fits inside it. So the next time you are tempted to over-explain, to defend your character, to beg for love, remember this. Your silence is your final word. Your absence is your loudest answer. Let her wonder, let her miss you. Let her sit in the emptiness she created, because you did not disappear to be cruel. You disappeared to protect your peace. Men, I need you to understand this. You were not born to orbit her world. You were not created to spin in circles around her moods, her desires, her timing. That's not love, that's captivity. And too many of you are enslaved to a woman's approval, waking up every day wondering, oh, what do I need to do to keep her happy? But what about you? What about your mission? What about your fire? Let me tell you something most women will not admit out loud because it scares them. A man on a mission is dangerous, not because he hurts anyone, but because he cannot be controlled. His emotions aren't dictated by her silence. His self-worth is not defined by her affection. His direction is not interrupted by rejection. And that is magnetic. That is what keeps a woman up at night thinking about you long after you have stopped calling. A man chasing purpose walks differently. He does not walk behind her hoping to be chosen. He walks forward focused, driven, and she has to catch up. That's not ego, that's alignment. See, when you make a woman your purpose, you lose your identity, you slowly disappear, you stop building, you stop dreaming, you trade your ambitions for attention. And the worst part, she starts to resent you for it. Because deep down, she does not want a man who makes her his everything. She wants a man who already had something going before she came along, something so powerful that it made her want to earn a place in it. Your purpose is not a backup plan, it's your lifeline. And when you are locked into it, women feel it. You're not texting all day waiting on her replies. You're not sulking when she's cold. You're not unraveling every time she pulls away. Why? Because your life is full. You've got goals, you've got vision, you've got places to go, and she can either come along for the ride or get left behind. And if she leaves, you do not crumble, you rise, you use that pain as fuel, you hit the gym, you start the business, you deepen your faith. You build your empire because your value was never in being loved by her. It was in fulfilling the calling inside you. The irony is, when you stop chasing women and start chasing purpose, women chase you. Not because you are playing games, but because you have become rare, you've become solid, unavailable to foolishness. And she knows men like you do not come around often. Men like you do not wait around. Men like you do not need her. And that changes everything. So stop making her your focus. She is not your destination. She is a bonus, not the blueprint. Your life is the mission, your growth is the goal, your calling is the compass. And when you follow that, you do not lose women. You attract better ones. Ones who rise to meet you, not ones who drain you just to keep you. It's one of the most misunderstood forms of strength a man can ever develop. Most people hear the word and think it means coldness, that you do not care, that you are emotionally distant or unavailable, but that could not be further from the truth. Detachment is not about not loving her. It's about not needing her love to survive. It's the moment you realize you can care deeply, give fully, feel everything, and still walk away when your peace is on the line. Detachment is lesson 4, chase purpose. Not women loving her without losing yourself. It's seeing the red flags and not painting them white just because you are afraid to be alone. It's not detachment from her. It's detachment from the outcome. Because a man who is emotionally detached does not crumble when she changes. He does not beg when she withdraws. He does not panic when her tone shifts or when she pulls away. He observes. He stays calm. He leans into his own clarity. And that silence, that grounded energy, it disarms her. See, emotional detachment is power. Not power over her, but power over yourself. It's the ability to feel everything, but still act in alignment with your values. And when a woman feels that she reacts, suddenly she's second-guessing her games. She's wondering why you are not reacting the way other men do, why you are not trying harder, why you are not fixing it. And the truth is, she knows she cannot control you anymore. That's when the panic sets in, because emotional control was her leverage and now it is gone. And no, this is not about manipulating her emotions. It's about no longer letting her manipulate yours. Most men have been trained to believe that the more emotionally available they are, the more loved they'll be. But the reality is being emotionally available without boundaries is like opening your home and letting someone walk through with muddy shoes. Scratch the walls and rearrange everything and you just smile because you love them. That's not love. That's self-abandonment. Detachment says, I can love you and still walk away. I can forgive you and still choose myself. I can feel the hurt and still protect my peace. When you become that man, the game shifts. Not because you are trying to win, but because you are no longer playing. And the thing is, she'll feel it. She'll feel the shift. She'll notice your silence. She'll check if you viewed her story. She'll overthink your last message. Not because you are playing hard to get, but because you are finally hard to reach. You're not reacting anymore. You're not bleeding for someone who wouldn't even hand you a bandage. You're emotionally grounded now, centered, whole. That's the man she respects. That's the man she regrets losing. So do not be afraid to detach, because when you do it with self-respect, with clarity, and with peace, you do not become colder, you become stronger. And from that place, real love, the kind that does not need games, can finally begin. Let me say something to you that no one said when you were younger. You are the prize, not because of what you have, not because of your looks or your status or your money, but because of who you are becoming. And until you believe that you will keep handing your worth to women who never deserved it in the first place, they told you she was the prize, that you had to win her, chase her, prove to her that you are good enough, that her attention was your reward if you behaved, if you performed, if you gave enough. But here's what they did not tell you. The moment you make someone. Lesson 5, when you detach, she reacts, else the prize. You forget that you were never meant to compete. You were meant to lead. You are the prize when you walk in purpose. You are the prize when you honor your word. You are the prize when you set standards and hold them. You are the prize when you show restraint. When you do not fall for lust in a cheap dress or validation wrapped in fake affection. You are the prize when you stop choosing women out of loneliness and stop choosing from wholeness. And yes, when you start to act like the prize, some women will call you arrogant. Let them. Because the truth is, a man who finally knows his worth terrifies a woman who only knew how to manipulate his insecurity. You become unpredictable, unreachable, and deeply attractive. But being the prize is not about ego, it's about energy. It's the energy of a man who is full with or without her, who does not need her approval to feel like a man, who does not chase love because he is love. Grounded, strong, and silent in his knowing. It's in how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you stop explaining your boundaries, how you stop apologizing for being unavailable to nonsense, how you stop shrinking so she can feel big. You do not beg to be understood anymore. You do not argue with disrespect. You just leave. That's the energy of a man who knows he is the prize. And here's what happens. The moment you truly walk in that truth, everything shifts. She starts to question herself. She starts to reflect. She realizes she's not dealing with just another man she can bend. She's standing in front of a mirror, a man who forces her to see her own behavior, a man who does not flinch when she withdraws, a man who does not fold when she tests him because you are not afraid to lose her anymore. You're afraid to lose yourself. And that fear that's sacred, that's the kind of fear that builds kings. So today, stop begging for a seat at her table. Build your own. Stop waiting to be chosen. Choose yourself. And when you do, something beautiful happens. You stop chasing love, and you start attracting women who respect honor and rise to meet you because a real woman knows. When a man walks like the prize, he does not ask to be seen. He is seen. There's a silence that comes when a man finally wakes up. When he stops begging to be seen and starts seeing himself. When he's no longer driven by fear of losing her, but by the fear of losing who he's meant to be. And that moment, that's the rebirth. It's the moment he stops texting paragraphs and starts building peace. The moment he stops seeking closure and starts building clarity. The moment he stands in the mirror, tired of the games, tired of shrinking, tired of questioning his worth, and whispers to himself, "No, lesson 6, you are the prize. Walk like it more. No more over-explaining, no more proving, no more chasing, no more abandoning yourself to be loved by someone who does not even know what love is. Because here's the truth. The moment you choose you, the world will try to guilt you into going back. The women who dismissed you will resurface. The ones who played games will suddenly miss you. But it will not hit the same because now you are not the same man anymore. You're walking slower, heavier, sharper, not bitter, just built differently. Because you remembered what they tried to make you forget. You were the prize you always were. So to every man watching this right now, if you felt this in your soul, this is your moment to draw the line. Not in anger, in peace, quietly, fully, powerfully. Walk away from anything that makes you forget your value. Walk toward the man you are becoming. Walk like the prize you are and let the world feel your absence. Drop a comment below and write, "I choose me." Let the world know this is your moment. This is your return. This is your rebirth. Hit that subscribe button right now, not just for content, but for clarity, for emotional truth, for reminders of who you really are. Like this video, if it woke something up inside you, share it with a brother, emotional peak. Closing message plus call to action, who's lost himself in the pursuit of someone who never deserved his love because he needs this message as badly as you did. And when they ask what happened to you, tell them you stopped begging to be loved and started loving yourself like your life depended on it, because it does.
Because it is easy, but because it is essential. Because every trial faced with wisdom adds a new layer of armor to your mind, a new line of clarity to your worldview, a new depth of resilience to your soul. Think of one obstacle in your life right now. Don't minimize it. Name it. Then write down what it could be. Training in you patience, humility, resilience, courage, clarity. Ask yourself, if this obstacle were a mentor, what would it be trying to teach me? Let that become your new lens. Let that become your practice. Meet the moment, engage with it, turn the weight into strength. Chapter 6. You choose discipline over distraction. In a world that thrives on interruption and feeds on urgency, discipline is a rebellion. It is a sacred act of resistance against the pull of distraction, noise, and mental clutter. The Stoics understood this deeply. They lived in times of great political unrest, temptation, and social chaos, and yet they chose to focus inward. They sharpened the blade of their attention and pointed it at the only target they could truly hit themselves. Discipline for the Stoic is not punishment, it is alignment. It is the conscious decision to not let the world write your script. Seneca said, "No person hands out their money to passers-by, but to how many do each of us hand out? Our lives were tight-fisted with property and money, yet think too little of wasting time. The one thing about which we should all be the most mislead. To be disciplined is to know what matters and then act like it. It is to wake up and remember your mission, not once, but every day, even when it's dull, even when it's draining. It is to say no with conviction to the trivial, the tempting, the loud, the shallow. It is the deliberate refusal to be scattered. It is the courage to sit in silence while the world chases noise. It is the strength to remain aligned when distraction promises relief. Discipline is not rigidity, but rhythm, a rhythm grounded in purpose, not preference to delay the easy thing so you can build the meaningful thing is to honor your future self. It is to understand that what is urgent is rarely what is important, and what is important will never shout as loudly as temptation. The Stoics knew this deeply. They knew that without discipline, philosophy becomes poetry, pleasant to hear, beautiful on paper, but useless in battle. They knew that a life of intention must be built brick by brick, decision by decision, in the quiet moments where no one is watching. You are walking the path when you stop, letting every impulse become action when you train yourself to notice the itch of distraction and choose presence. Instead, when you stop letting every craving become command, and instead begin consulting your principles before your pleasures, you shut the door on distraction, not because you hate it, but because you recognize it for what it is, a thief in disguise. You value your potential more. You respect your purpose. More discipline is not about willpower alone. It is about clarity. It is about cutting through the fog of temptation with the blade of intention. It is about knowing what matters most and protecting it fiercely, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's inconvenient, unglamorous, and quiet. It's what you do in the shadows when no one is watching that reveals the depth of your discipline. It is about creating a life of integrity where your actions echo your values so consistently that even your internal resistance begins to yield. It's about building habits that echo your deepest commitments, not fleeting goals, not shallow rewards, but values that transcend mood and circumstance, especially when it's hardest to do so, when you're tired, when you're bored, when every excuse feels valid. Discipline is what brings you back when others waver. You return to the foundation. When your mind wanders, you gently guide it back, not with shame, but with persistence. Discipline is not brute force. It is elegant redirection. Practiced over time, it becomes not just an act, but a second nature, an identity, a rhythm that defines the way you move through the world. It becomes the gravity that holds your life in shape, keeping your priorities from drifting and your focus from scattering. Identify one area of your life where you feel pulled by distraction. Zoom in, feel the friction. Now, ask, what would a disciplined version of me do differently today? How would that version respond to this moment, this temptation, this fork in the road? Do that just once. Then again, protect your energy like a fortress. Don't apologize for it. Let your boundaries speak your vision, and then watch what you can build within clarity, strength, mastery, and peace. Chapter 7. You practice voluntary discomfort. Comfort, when it becomes constant, becomes a cage. It may feel soft and safe, but over time, it corrodes the edge of our strength. The Stoics did not fear discomfort. They practiced it. They embraced it, not because they were ascetics or masochists, but because they understood Otto's truth. If you can train yourself to go without what you desire, then you can never be enslaved by it. True freedom is not found in indulging every craving, but in learning that you can live, even thrive, without it. Seneca once spent days sleeping on the floor and eating coarse bread, not to dramatize austerity, but to ask himself a powerful question. Is this what I feared? That experience was not self-punishment. It was self-liberation to walk through the very thing you fear and find that you are still standing still. Breathing still whole is to reclaim power over it. If you can thrive in less, you become more. If you can endure cold, hunger, solitude, or fatigue, then you are no longer held hostage by them. They lose their threat. You rise in stature. The practice of voluntary discomfort is glorifying suffering. It's about clarifying perspective. It's about reminding yourself that comfort is not the same as happiness, and that pleasure is not the same as peace. It's about perfecting yourself. That comfort is a preference, not a necessity. That you can train your body to endure more than it wants, and your mind to hold steady when ease is nowhere in sight. It's about hardening the mind before life hardens it for you, because life will test you. And if you've never practiced discomfort, the smallest trial will feel like collapse. But if you've chosen discomfort on your own terms, you are already tempered. If you avoid every discomfort, you weaken your resilience. You make yourself fragile. But if you choose discomfort strategically, with intention and discipline, you prepare your soul for anything. You inoculate yourself against fear. You make yourself durable, adaptable, operable. You are walking the Stoic path. When you stop running from discomfort and start walking toward it, when you choose the cold shower, waking up in the early morning, the hard conversation, when you willingly deny yourself, ease not to suffer, but to grow, when you learn to sit in hunger, silence, heat, or solitude without complaint, when you stop making comfort a condition for action, when you say, I will not wait for adversity to shape me, I will shape myself. I will become the fire before the world forces me into the flame. This week, choose one comfort to go without screens after a certain hour. Sugar fast food chips, salty snacks, hot water showers, even your usual chair. Do it not to punish yourself, but to train your independence. Let your discomfort remind you, I am more than my cravings. Chapter 8. You anchor your life in principles, not moods. The modern world teaches you to follow your feelings, to act on impulse, to make mood your master. But the Stoics taught the opposite. Follow your principles, let reason not. Emotion be the engine of your action. Moods fluctuate, principles do not. If you only act when you feel motivated, you will be inconsistent at best, and lost, aimless, and easily manipulated at worst. But if you act based on values, you become something rare in this world, solid grounded, untouchable. You become someone others look to when the storm hits, not because you're always happy, but because you're always anchored. Marcus Aurelius wrote, just that you do the right thing. The rest doesn't matter. Not how you feel about it, not who approves, not whether it's convenient, just that you do the right thing. This sentence is the heartbeat of Stoicism. The Stoic doesn't ask, what do I feel like doing today? They ask, what would virtue do today? What would the best version of me choose in this moment? They understand that feelings are visitors, sometimes wise, often deceiving, but values are residents. And a life built on values is a life with foundation. To build a life on principles means you become your own lighthouse. In emotional fog, it means you are no longer governed by mood swings, weather patterns, or social media algorithms. You stop outsourcing your decision-making to the shifting sands of emotion. You no longer live as a leaf tossed by the wind. You become a rooted tree still, present, aligned. You have something stronger than impulse. You have a North Star, a direction, a code. You know who you are and what you stand for, even when your emotions scream otherwise, even when the world offers you 1,000 reasons to quit, break, or conform. You're walking the path when your behavior is no longer dictated by motivation, but by meaning. When your actions are grounded, not in fleeting excitement, but in lasting purpose. When you stop waiting to feel good before you do good, and instead choose to do good because it is good. When your identity isn't built on how you feel, but on what you uphold, what you are willing to live for and perhaps even suffer for. When you begin to notice that real confidence doesn't come from riding the high of motivation, but from showing up when it's gone, when there is no applause, no reward, just the quiet conviction that you are living aligned when discipline continues after inspiration fades, and your effort is sustained by integrity, not adrenaline when you show up on the days you'd rather disappear, and honor your commitments even when no one else knows or cares, when you hold to your standard, not because it feels good, but because it is good, because it is right, because it is yours to live by. Principle is not to be perfect. It is to be consistent. It is to fail forward. It is to fall, recalibrate, and return. It is to live with structure in the midst of chaos, to hold an inner order, even when the world is unraveling, to live with calm in the middle of fire, not because you are detached, but because you are rooted. It is not glamorous. It is not always praised. In fact, it is often invisible, but it is unshakable. It is not noise. It is signal. The Stoic doesn't seek approval for it. They don't do it for show. They do it because it aligns their life. Because a life without principle is adrift without anchor. Because the cost of compromising their code is greater than the cost of discomfort. Delay or discipline, when you choose your code over your convenience, your values over your vanity, your integrity over your insecurity, you are walking the same path. Marcus Aurelius once walked not above the world, but above its illusions, not detached from life, but deeply connected to its truest rhythm. Choose one guiding principle: honesty, courage, kindness, self-discipline. Write it down, not just in your notes, but on your heart. Let it be more than a concept. Let it be a contract, a vow, a daily intention. Then begin to observe yourself closely, as if you were studying your own character in real time. Track how many of your actions today align with that principle, not in grand gestures, but in the smallest choices. How you respond to irritation, how you speak to strangers, how you handle temptation, how you show up when it's uncomfortable. Review it at night. Ask, did I live by this today? Not to judge, but to clarify, not to condemn, but to realign. Be honest. Were there moments you abandoned it for ease? Were there moments you upheld it despite resistance? Let your evening reflection become a sharpening stone, not for guilt, but for growth. Begin living by that principle, not only when it feels natural, but especially when it feels inconvenient, when you're tired, when you're under pressure, when it would be so much easier to take the shortcut. That's when it matters most. That's when the virtue begins to shape you. Let your principle become your compass, not just in easy moments, but in uncertain ones, when the path forks, when emotions flare, when fear clouds your sight. That's when your principle becomes your guide. And if you fail, and you will, that's not a reason to stop. That's a reason to return. Recommit, re-engage, reflect. The Stoics knew failure was inevitable, but they refused to let it become final. They didn't aim for perfection. They aimed for persistence. They understood that stumbling was part of the journey, but quitting was not. Each fall is a signal, not of weakness, but of where the next layer of strength needs to be built. Let each day be a new opportunity to embody what you believe. Let every failure become fertilizer. Let every shortfall refine your commitment. The Stoic understands that growth is not linear and transformation is not instantaneous. It is gradual, forged in repetition and tested in fatigue. If you abandon your principle after one failure, you never believed in it. But if you return to it again and again, you begin to embody it not just as a behavior, but as a way of being over time. That single principle practiced daily becomes the backbone of your integrity. It becomes your moral architecture, the invisible framework that shapes every decision, every boundary, every expression of who you are. It becomes the origin of your clarity, the reason you can think straight when others are lost in noise, the reason you remain steady when the winds shift. The seed of your strength planted in discipline, watered in humility, and grown in repetition, until it blooms into character that nothing can take from you. Chapter 9. You master the inner dialogue. The battle that matters most is the one no one else sees. The one that happens in your mind. The Stoics knew this intimately long before neuroscience, long before therapy apps. They understood that the way we speak to ourselves shapes our entire world. Thoughts may be invisible, but their impact is not. They can either chain us or free us, corrupt us or cleanse us, paralyze us or move us toward greatness. Epictetus wrote, "It's not things that disturb us, but our interpretation of them." The Stoic realizes that between what happens and what it means lies the voice of our own judgment. And if that voice is undisciplined, irrational, or self-defeating, then peace and purpose become impossible. So they train the voice, they challenge the thought, they interrogate the narrative. The Stoic mind is not loud, but it is deeply aware. Mastering your inner dialogue means refusing to let your mind become a breeding ground for negativity, resentment, or helplessness. It means observing your thoughts without being ruled by them. It means knowing the difference between a thought and a truth, between an emotion and a command. You can feel fear and still act. You can notice doubt and still choose courage. The Stoic doesn't silence their mind, they sharpen it. You are walking the path when you take responsibility for your inner voice, when you stop letting thoughts run wild and begin to question the lens through which you perceive the world. You catch yourself in spirals of self-pity or rage and choose to stop, not through suppression, which buries the fire deeper, but through redirection, which transforms it. You step back, you breathe, you ask, is this thought useful? Is it true? Is it helping me become who I wish to be? This is not denial. It is discernment. You begin to recognize the difference between what simply passes through your mind and what deserves to remain there when you replace panic with a pause. You give yourself the space to lead, not be led. You reclaim your authority over the inner realm. You no longer let emotions storm in and seize control. Instead, you slow the moment down. You remind yourself, I am the thinker of these thoughts, not their slave. You start choosing your inner language with intention. When you speak to yourself, it's no longer with indulgence that excuses weakness, nor with abuse that damages your spirit. You speak with discipline, with the steady voice of a mentor, and with dignity, as if your soul is something sacred, worth protecting and strengthening. The Stoic knows if you win in the mind, you've already won in the world, because the outer battle is only ever a reflection of the inner one. And the mind, once mastered, becomes not only your defense, but your greatest weapon, your deepest well of strength, and your clearest source of peace. Take one recurring thought, especially a negative or anxious one, and write it down. Then rewrite it from the perspective of your highest self, not your fear, but your wisdom. Read it every morning and evening. Let it become the new voice echoing inside your mind. Chapter 10. You live for impact, not image, in a world obsessed with perception. The Stoic is obsessed with substance. The modern mind craves attention, validation, visibility, but the Stoic mind craves truth. It is not interested in how things appear, but in how things are. It asks not, do they see me winning, but am I becoming someone worth being? This distinction is everything. The former traps you. In a life of performance, the latter roots you in a life of purpose, Seneca warned, "What is the point of having countless books and libraries whose titles the owner could scarcely read through in a lifetime? The number only confuses a learner instead of instructing him." The Stoic applies the same logic to reputation. What good is being admired if you are empty inside? What good is fame? If your character is hollow, what does it serve you to be known widely, but understood shallowly, or worse, to be celebrated outwardly while suffering inwardly? The Stoic does not chase applause. They chase alignment. They do not seek to impress. They seek to become, not to be admired, but to be anchored, not to be followed, but to be forged. When you live for impact, you stop needing to be seen. You stop designing your life around optics and start rooting it in purpose. You start needing to be useful to matter, not in headlines, but in households, not in noise, but in quiet acts of truth. You begin to ask new questions, not how does this look, but what does this contribute? Not will this go viral, but will this endure? You ask, what can I give? How can I serve? What legacy am I building in silence? What ripples will this leave after I'm gone? The Stoic doesn't broadcast their principles. They embody them. They wear virtue, not as a slogan, but as a second skin. They are known by their consistency, their discipline, their substance, not their marketing. Their reputation is a shadow, not the goal. You are walking the Stoic path when you stop measuring success by metrics and start measuring it by meaning. When your victories are internal, silent, personal, anchored in integrity, and your compass points steadily toward contribution, not recognition. When your first instinct is no longer to be seen, but to be sincere, you begin to ask, not, did they notice me, but did I move something forward today? Did I make someone stronger, wiser, or more grounded just by being present? This is where the Stoic lives, not in the limelight, but in the quiet corners of impact. You let go of the obsession to be liked and replace it with the intention to be useful. You shift your aim from applause to alignment, from pleasing crowds to pleasing your conscience. The reward is no longer visibility. It is virtue. You no longer perform for validation because you have found validation. In principle, you don't chase relevance. You chase meaning. You begin to live in such a way that if your life were private, if it were never shared or praised or promoted, it would still be deeply worthwhile because you would know you are aligned. Your life becomes less about showcasing and more about shaping. shaping yourself into someone strong, just, and dependable. Shaping the world around you through quiet service and unseen effort, you begin to feel the richness of invisible contribution. You start to value legacy over attention, intention over reaction. You ask not, how does this appear? But what does this produce? You know that lasting influence is often planted in places no one will ever see. And you're okay with that because you've chosen the deeper path. You seek not attention but authenticity. You are no longer a brand, you are a force. You walk into rooms not needing to dominate them but to uplift them. You move through life, not polishing your image, but sharpening your soul. You do not need to shine, you need to stand. You do not need to be seen. You need to matter. And when that becomes your way of life, you have not just studied stoicism. You have lived it. Audit one area of your life where image has taken priority over impact. Social media, career choices, even conversations. Is there something you're doing more for how it looks than what it means? Are you choosing visibility over value? Side with that. Ask yourself, if no one ever saw this, would I still do it? Would I still say this, wear this, post this, pursue this if there were no likes, no applause, no recognition waiting at the end? Let that question strip away the performance. Let it expose what's genuine. Then go deeper. Ask, what would I do more of if I wasn't worried about how it looked? What would I let go of if I didn't need it to be admired? Let those questions refine your priorities. Let them guide you toward alignment. The goal is not to disappear, but to become undeniable in your truth, to do fewer things for show and more things for substance. Let that question guide you not just back to what matters, but into a life that means something, even if no one is watching. Keeping an eye on livestock doors and suspicious rustling. Sometimes these watchers fell asleep in the haystack. Sometimes they wandered off for ale. But the idea was there. Mutual protection in the hours when the world felt thinnest. The night, in all its flickering complexity, was not idle. It breathed, whispered, worked, while most households slept, curled together near the fire. A quiet minority stayed upright, eyes adjusting to the dark, hands, busy minds awake. They were not waiting for the morning, they were carrying the hours forward. One task at a time, morning had come and gone, work was in full swing. The fire was steady while the goat is inside. Again, the pig had been retrieved from the neighbors. Cabbage Patch bread was cooling, soup was boiling, and somewhere a child was loudly denying responsibility for a mess that had not yet been discovered. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, a moment of quiet expectation fell across the village. Midday, rest was near, not universal, not leisurely, but present the closest thing most people had to a break. This pause, though brief, mattered. The human body could only shovel, lift, scrub, and argue with livestock for so many hours before beginning to malfunction, even in the 1300s, when expectations for comfort were criminally low. People needed to stop and breathe. Rest was not about relaxation, it was about recalibration. The tools went down, the pot was stirred, someone sat. Someone else leaned against a wall. It was not peace, but it resembled it from a distance. In summer months, rest often occurred outdoors. A tree, a low wall, a shadow stretching across the dirt. These became temporary refuges. People sat wherever they could, chewing bread, sipping ale, or simply blinking at the horizon, like it owed them an explanation in winter. They huddled near the hearth, shoulders tight, hands wrapped around warm mugs. Silence was common. Words were not wasted. Neither was movement. If someone adjusted their position, it was only because part of their body had gone numb. Meals during midday were not elaborate bread, again, cheese, if it had survived the rats. Some dried fruit, perhaps broth reheated for the third time, and now sporting a mysterious floating herb that no one could identify, but everyone pretended was medicinal ale. Was the preferred drink what was suspicious tea, as it would later be known, had not yet made its presence felt. Coffee was an ocean away. What people had was warmth, calories, and the hope that no one would ask them to stand up for at least 10 minutes. Children were often the least still, while adults collapsed. Children took the opportunity to run chase chickens, argue over pebbles, or invent games involving sticks, mud, and escalating injuries. Occasionally, one would fall asleep mid-motion, face down in the straw, and be left there like a decorative inconvenience. Rest was not equally distributed. It was earned or seized, depending on the personality in larger households. Midday rest became a quiet sort of regrouping. Someone mended a tear, someone else checked the stew. A third person stared into the fire like it owed them something. Conversations happened in low voices. They drifted between weather harvest and mild insults about someone's laundry technique. No one expected philosophical revelations. They expected everyone to eat, breathe, and not accidentally knock over the firewood again. In towns, the pause was slightly more structured. Market activities slowed. Tools were downed. Apprentices were granted a sliver of time to stare blankly at a wall before being ordered to fetch something heavy and unnecessary. The bell of a local church might toll the hour, reminding everyone that God was still watching, even if he had a strange sense of humor regarding human comfort. A few brave souls attempted napping. This was not always successful. The noise, the cold, the lumpy straw, and the goat's decision to rearrange the storage baskets made deep rest elusive, but some managed it. Curled in corners under benches beside the hearth, if someone snored, it was a sign of victory. If someone drooled, they were declared mayor of the break. A lesser-known practice in certain regions was the use of herbal cushions, small cloth pouches filled with dried lavender, mint, or thyme, placed near the face during rest. These were thought to ease headaches, soothe nerves, and distract from the pervasive smell of wet wool and stale onions. Whether the herbs worked is unclear, but the placebo effect likely had a decent batting average. This was also the hour for quiet repairs. Rope was retied. Baskets were reinforced, socks. Those rare, precious items were patched. Most clothing saw heavy use and light maintenance. People mended, not to preserve fashion, but to delay replacement. New garments were expensive. A well-patched tunic was a badge of practicality, if not exactly a mark of sophistication. For some, rest meant prayer, a whispered psalm, a finger traced across a splintering crucifix, a nod toward the rafters. In case anything was listening, these acts were small, habitual faith like. Warmth was measured in increments. A brief glance upward, then back to the bowl. Despite its name, midday rest was rarely restful in the romantic sense. It was not an escape, it was a pivot, a moment to shift from one half of the day into the next. Fatigue did not vanish. It simply became slightly more tolerable. The aches remained, the noise returned, but for a brief spell the world moved a little slower when rest ended. It did so without fanfare. Someone stood, someone else sighed. A child was shaken awake, tools were lifted, the fire was stoked, the goat, sensing renewed structure, immediately attempted sabotage. The rhythm resumed. It always did work, did not change much in the afternoon. It just continued if a fence had been halfway mended before rest. It now reached 34. If laundry had been soaking, it was now beaten against a rock with increasing hostility. If someone had dropped a spoon into the cooking pot before resting, they were now trying to retrieve it with a stick and a facial expression that conveyed spiritual defeat. Afternoon light shifted quickly. What began as golden warmth soon turned angled gray, and sharp shadows. Stretched roof lines turned orange, then purple. The chickens, governed by a schedule more ancient than any human plan, began to wander back toward the coop, clucking to themselves like bureaucrats returning from a disappointing conference in some households. Evening preparations began early. The stew was checked again. The fire fed again, blankets shook out, beds poked into shape, cloaks rearranged on hooks or pegs. If the goat was still inside, someone carried it out. If it was already out, someone brought it back in. The goat's agenda remained inscrutable. Children by this point began to fade, their earlier chaos dimmed into dragging feet, louder yawns, and the occasional tantrum. Regarding whose turn it was to sleep near the fire, elders became more vocal, usually about how everything had been better, cleaner, or quieter in the previous century. No one believed them, but no one interrupted either. One fringe behavior, occasionally noted in household accounts, was the evening blowing of horns, not for celebration, but to call home workers still in the fields or woods. These were short, low blasts, sometimes mistaken for animal calls that echoed across valleys and told someone that the pot was on and their absence was being noticed. It was not particularly romantic, but it was effective. As the final hour of daylight slipped away, the house tilted once again toward night. The cycle resumed. Animals fed beds, readied fire, banked. But before all that, there had been this midday rest. A crack in the wall of endless labor, not wide enough to escape through, but enough to catch a breath, shake out a thought, and briefly, very briefly, feel human. The fire, the floor, and the final chore. As twilight descended, the village transformed again, the fields darkened. Smoke rose steadily from thatched chimneys. Doors were latched with a finality that said nothing more would be attempted. Today the world outside faded to a dull hush, broken only by animals bedding down, and the occasional cackle from a distant hen who had found the best nesting spot. 5 minutes too late. Inside, the household returned to its evening rhythm. familiar, unremarkable, and entirely vital. This was the time for quiet chores, last-minute fixes, and the sacred ritual of pretending the workday had been shorter than it truly was. Rush lights were lit. Shoes were checked for dampness. Someone peered into a pot with the vague hope that food had multiplied since last. Checked it had not. Dinner remained a variation of the previous meal, warm, lumpy, and full of personality. There were no new ingredients. There were only new excuses. Evening meals were not social events. They were structural necessities. The same bread, the same stew. Occasionally, someone offered a suggestion: more salt, less turnip, fewer bones next time. But such feedback was rarely rewarded. Conversation remained minimal, drifting between weather complaints and brief disputes about who had left the door open during the last frost. Firelight dominated the space. It shaped the mood. Shadows flickered across the beams. Faces glowed with the same red-gold hue as the inside of the pot. No one moved far from the hearth. Unless required, even the goat, if present indoors, arranged itself into a semicircle near the warmth, half asleep and entirely indifferent to domestic politics for children. This was the hour of slipperiness tasks. Forgotten socks, misplaced, unresolved squabbles. Reignited in the corner, an adult exhausted beyond articulation might bark an order that contained no verbs, only pointed gestures and a low growl. Children obeyed eventually, often after being physically relocated. Older members of the household grew quieter. Some mended garments slowly, and with the resigned intensity of those who knew the seam would unravel again tomorrow. Others poked at their feet, inspecting blisters or wiping off traces of the day's more treacherous activities. A few leaned back and stared into the fire, trying to remember if it was Tuesday or if that had already happened this week. In many homes, this was the only time available for small luxuries. Combing hair, oiling boots, or reheating a stone for placing at the foot of the bed. These gestures were not for indulgence. They were to avoid disaster. A misaligned boot, LED to a limp, an unwatched ember to a hole in the bedding. Prevention was more restful than cure. The fire needed constant maintenance. It was never left alone. Ash was stirred. Wood was added. Someone crouched nearby, holding a stick like a scepter, issuing subtle threats to the flame. In some households, there was a fire, turn a rotational duty often dreaded, that ensured the embers would survive into morning forgetting. The fire turned LED to frost-bitten toes, and recriminations that echoed well past sunrise. Stories were sometimes told in this hour. Not fairy tales, but practical warnings dressed in metaphor. The girl who stepped in the well, the boy who disobeyed and was chased by a talking pig. Cautionary tales carried forward by memory and repetition, trimmed of wonder and sharpened for effectiveness. Laughter occurred, but quietly, like it had been rationed. One curious detail: some medieval families kept tokens near the hearth. Small figurines, blessed herbs, or bits of old cloth wrapped around a nail. These were not decorations. They were protective symbols meant to guard against spirits, bad dreams, and that specific cousin who always brought drama. Whether they worked was unknown, but removing them was not advised. In wealthier homes, evening involved a little more ceremony. A servant might pour warm water for washing beds, might be fluff. Slippers appeared, brought in from where they had been airing out in the hallway. Guests, if present, were offered the best stool and a share of the thicker end of the pottage. Conversation remained restrained unless wine had appeared, at which point someone might recite a poem and someone else would sigh loudly. and pretend to admire it literacy where it existed. Sometimes changed the tone a few could read aloud. Psalms, prayers, popular romances about knights who made poor decisions and were then surprised when things escalated. Pages turned. Slowly. Light was dim, the reader's voice rose and fell, and even those who could not follow the words listened anyway, because voices, unlike goats, could be calming even in more ordinary households. A kind of stillness emerged. Chores, finished food, eaten children quieted outside. The wind sharpened inside, bodies sagged toward the bedding. The fire snapped once loudly, and everyone flinched except for the oldest person in the room, who had heard louder things on quieter nights. Clothing for sleep was whatever had survived the day. There were no nightgowns, only tunics, slightly less filthy than the others. Layers were added, hats were pulled low if someone removed their belt. It was not for comfort, but because it had started, leaving marks. Straw was fluffed, blankets were rearranged, feet were tucked under anything warm. The pile began to take shape. Sleep approached unevenly. Some dropped into it like stones into a pond. Others lingered, eyes half open, staring at the rafters and listening to the night breathe. It was not quiet. Mice scratched beams, creaked. A dog howled in the distance, and someone half asleep whispered that it was an omen. Then immediately began snoring. People spoke little in these last moments, a muttered complaint, a whispered prayer, the sound of someone attempting to move silently and failing completely. The household shifted toward stillness, dragging its remaining thoughts into dreams. It was not serenity, it was necessity, and that was often enough. A fringe belief persisted in parts of Europe that bad dreams could be prevented by placing a bowl of water under the bed. The water, it was said, absorbed evil or confused the spirit trying to enter, or made the floor too slippery for mischief. The explanations varied. The bowl remained. Occasionally, someone kicked it over in the night and blamed it on demons in certain rural areas. Evening involved an extra ritual, tossing a handful of salt over the threshold, not for seasoning, for luck or protection, or because someone's great-grandmother said it should be done, and no one felt brave enough to stop doing it. Tradition and suspicion often looked identical after dark. The final act of the evening was the fire. Banking ash was heaped over the coals. The light dimmed. Someone adjusted the blanket over the baby. Someone else repositioned the family's least cooperative leg. Then, with no announcement, the house fell into its first sleep. Not deep, not undisturbed, but present outside the village darkened. No lamps in windows, no movement in alleys, only smoke rising and the wind pressing gently at shutters. Inside, breath slowed heat, faded, and the world paused again sometime after midnight. The house stirred. Footsteps in the straw and questions in the dark. Not with purpose, not with clarity, just enough to remind everyone that sleep in the 1300s did not come all at once or stay all the way through. This was the hour of segmented slumber, the gap between the first and second sleep. The first sleep had ended without ceremony. Perhaps someone rolled over, perhaps someone coughed, perhaps a dog barked at the wind again, and no one was sure if it was the same wind as earlier. Whatever the cause, the waking was not jarring. It was familiar. Expected in medieval life, sleeping in two shifts was not unusual. It was the default, historians still argue, whether the split sleep arose from practical necessity or natural rhythm. Either way, it seemed to work. People fell asleep shortly after sundown, woke around midnight, remained awake for an hour or two, then returned to bed. This interlude was sometimes called the watch, which sounded far more intentional than it usually was. During the watch, people did what people always do when sleep deserts them. They stirred the fire, they visited the chamber pot. They whispered to one another too quietly. For goats or children to overhear in some households, it was the only time a couple had to speak without interruption or assignment. These moments were private and strange, part memory, part dream. Lighting was minimal, a single candle, maybe embers. Mostly those who moved about did so by memory, and toe injuries, voices stayed low. The walls of medieval homes were not thick, and privacy was mostly theoretical. Still, something about the watch made people feel wrapped in a separate time, unmeasured by tools or tasks. Prayer was common during this interval. The hours of night were thought to be sacred. Dangerous, or both. Certain monastic traditions marked these hours with chanting. Peasants marked them with muttering and the hope that no one would knock on the door with bad news. It was a time for quiet reflection or mild complaints about straw in one's ear. Some took this time to check on livestock. A cow might be close to calving a goat, might be missing chickens, might be arguing with a mouse walking outside. Was risky. The cold was sharp, and spirits, according to rumor, walked freely. In the blue hours, still necessities overruled. Superstition. Boots were pulled on, doors were opened, the night inhaled. There were practical uses for the wakeful hour. Nets were mended, bread was kneaded. Wounds were inspected by firelight, as if scalding them would accelerate healing. For those who had the rare gift of literacy, this was the best time to read. Quiet, still, and uninterrupted by requests to carry something heavy. In towns, the second sleep period was even more irregular. Some homes never quite settled after midnight. Inns stayed noisy, streets held pockets of activity. Thieves preferred this stretch. People asleep enough to be slow awake enough to be unaware. Watchmen muttered to each other about lantern oil and the unnatural behavior of cats. One odd belief from the period held that the time between sleeps was ideal for conception. This was not based on any scientific understanding, but on the assumption that the body had been reset by the first rest and was therefore more receptive. Whether this held any truth is unknown, but the claim appeared often enough in medical texts to be noticed and quietly judged. The transition between the two sleeps was rarely dramatic. One moment, a person might be mending a sock. The next, they were snoring into it. Sleep returned, slowly, like fog crawling back into a valley. No one signaled the second shift. It simply happened. The fire settled. The air cooled, straw rustled, silence resumed. This sleep, the second one, often held deeper dreams. The first sleep burned off the day. The second explored stranger places. People reported visions, visitations, and revelations. A few believed these dreams carried messages, divine, ancestral, or herbal in origin. More likely, they were a result of eating stew with too many unknown ingredients. The second sleep usually lasted until dawn. Its quality depended on luck, the weather, and the behavior of everyone else sharing the bedding. Kicks, snores, sudden shouts, all were common. No one apologized in the morning. Everyone was too tired to remember, and if they did remember, they pretended otherwise. Peace was easier when selective amnesia was mutual. Some households adapted this pattern more rigidly. They set aside a log or a special pillow for the waking seat reserved for the person who would tend the fire or listen for odd noises. This was not a position of honor. It was a form of preventative maintenance. The person on watch rarely made it through the entire interval without nodding off. But the illusion of vigilance satisfied the household. Others simply accepted that someone would always be awake. An elder, a restless child, a person with a sore back. The night was never truly silent. Snoring harmonized with the creak of beams. Dogs growled in their sleep. Rain-tapped mice squeaked the world. Breathed one superstition claimed that whispering someone's name during the watch could bring them dreams of you. Whether this was used for romance, mischief, or revenge is unclear. The more pressing concern was whether anyone could be heard whispering in the first place, since entire families slept inches apart. If the whisperer succeeded, they were probably awarded a medal made of bad judgment. In some villages, the watch became an unofficial hour for storytelling. Grandparents whispered to grandchildren. Tales of saints, sinners, and suspiciously talkative animals. These stories were brief, likely recycled, and ended abruptly. If the child fell asleep halfway through, which was considered the optimal result. A fringe practice involved placing iron objects at the foot of the bedding. During this interval, not for protection against bandits, but against fey creatures, wandering spirits, or whatever else might slip through the cracks in a poorly sealed door, an iron knife, a scissor, a horseshoe, anything dense and rust-prone. The logic was simple. Steel scared things. Whether this deterred spirits or simply added bruises to an already stiff population is unclear. By the time the second sleep reached its end, the fire had died down again. The air turned crisp. Breath fogged slightly above blankets. Light crept in through gaps and shutters. Somewhere, a rooster betrayed the entire concept of tranquility. People stirred. There was no alarm, no rooster-shaped clock. The return to waking life was gentle for some, abrupt for others. Someone's bladder made the decision. Someone else's dream concluded with a jolt. A child rolled off the bedding and announced it was morning. Technically, it was not. But trying to explain that to a child in the 13th was just as pointless as trying today. A few ambitious souls used the final moments before full dawn to finish small tasks, threading a needle, stretching a sore shoulder, staring into the hearth, like it might offer life advice. These were gestures, not accomplishments, but in a world that never stopped moving. Gestures counted for something. With the new day beginning, the rhythm repeated itself. First, sleep, wakeful hour. Second sleep, then. Noise, light, fire, motion, everything continued. There was comfort in the pattern. Not restfulness necessarily, but rhythm. And that rhythm floored as it was kept people from losing track of themselves. Split. Sleep eventually faded from common practice, replaced by consolidated rest as artificial lighting extended the day and changed how time was lived. But in the 1300s, this double sleep structure was normal. Accepted almost unnoticed, night was not one block of unconsciousness. It was an intermission, a breath, a fold in the fabric of time as people rose, rubbing eyes and muttering about how fast the fire had gone cold. No one discussed the watch. No one declared how they had used their wakeful hour. It belonged to the dark, a personal space within a communal life, brief, quiet, and utterly human. Waking up in the 1300s was not a graceful affair. The hour of murmurs and missing blankets. There were no soft alarms, no steaming mugs, and certainly no gentle piano melodies to greet the dawn. Instead, there was stiffness cold and the immediate awareness that something sharp had been dug into one side for most of the night. Whether that something was straw, a sibling's elbow, or a goat's hoof was largely irrelevant. The day had begun, and the floor was unforgiving. The first sound in many homes was not a rooster. It was coughing, loud, deliberate, competitive coughing, as if each member of the household needed to declare they had survived another night. After that came rustling, scraping, and the traditional early morning negotiation over whose turn it was to check the fire. No one volunteered. Someone always lost rekindling. The hearth was a critical ritual. If the embers had survived the night, congratulations, someone had banked the fire properly. If not, someone, often the youngest or slowest to pretend they were asleep, was sent to the neighbor's house to beg a coal. This small shame walk, complete with clay pot and frozen toes, was a common part of village life. The phrase, "let the fire die," was not a metaphor. It was an accusation. Once the fire caught, the room came back to life. Breath ceased to fog. Water buckets were checked. Usually frozen, a pot was placed on the hook to warm breakfast, which would be indistinguishable from dinner, which had not been very different from lunch. Someone stirred something. Someone else groaned while trying to locate a missing boot. A third individual, usually unnoticed, was already sweeping the hearth as if they had slept through a more dignified era. The order of rising was determined by proximity to the fire social hierarchy and who had rolled off the bedding. First, elders moved. Slowest, children were carried or threatened. Upright adults stretched, scratched, yawned, and said nothing, because words were expensive in the first hour and often wasted on complaints. That no one intended to fix clothing remained unchanged, unless the existing layer had developed holes large enough to become inconvenient. A fresh tunic was a special event. A washed one was nearly scandalous. Most garments were brushed off, retid, and pulled into approximate alignment. Laces were knotted, cloaks were thrown on belts, were tightened until circulation resumed. If a person's outfit smelled less offensive than yesterday, it was considered a win. Hygiene, such as it was, came next. Hands and faces were rinsed in cold water that inspired spiritual reflection. Teeth, if acknowledged at all, were wiped with cloth or rubbed with sage or salt. No one smiled. During this process, it was not for appearance. It was to prevent the slow march of rot from claiming another molar before Lent mouths were sometimes rinsed with wine. If water tasted questionable, which in fairness was nearly always, latrines when available were grim wooden seats over pits, some lined with straw, most shared with spiders, frost, and a level of smell that had achieved independent consciousness. Chamber pots emptied at the sunrise were carried outside with solemnity and held at arm's length. No one made eye contact with a neighbor during this task. Everyone understood some households had specific routes for dumping, so the splash zone did not overlap with the laundry area, an innovation born of experience. Not every home had a dedicated latrine. Some used the edge of the property. Some used buckets. A few had small, awkward shelters called garde-robes, which doubled as cold weather tests of character. These were often attached to the outer wall, so the waste fell directly into the moat or alley below. It was efficient, if not celebrated. Children occasionally leaned too far and were yanked back by their collars while being told stories about the unfortunate neighbor who had not been so lucky. Shoes were laced, cloaks were fastened, tools were retrieved from corners where they had been dropped the previous night. Children were sent to collect eggs, haul water, or bother someone else's. Livestock breakfast was eaten standing or not at all. Bread in one hand, half-silent argument in the other. Occasionally, someone attempted to eat while walking and was immediately reprimanded for such reckless behavior. In towns, the morning brought sound, bells rang, doors opened, merchants emerged with carts. Apprentices ran late for something they did not understand. The streets filled slowly, mud boots, chickens, and muttered curses, all returning to their natural habitats. Everything smelled of ash, hay, and someone else's stew. Rural homes began slower, but moved longer. Livestock needed feeding, fences were checked, tools were assessed for splinters or dents. The chores were endless, mostly identical and rarely celebrated, but they kept the household fed, clothed, and only moderately at odds with gravity. One documented fringe practice found in parts of Northern Europe involved greeting the morning sun with a handful of grain tossed eastward. It was meant to honor the day's return and confuse evil spirits who were apparently bad with directions. Some families also marked the first egg, laid each day with a small chalk mark for luck. These traditions faded with time, but were sincere. While they lasted, weather dictated much. A clear sky meant outdoor work, a gray one meant mud complaints and indoor tasks that involved tools no one liked. Rain shifted everything. It made the inside of homes darker, colder, and louder thatched roofs, while excellent at shedding water were less excellent at staying quiet. The sound of rain on thatch was either comforting or maddening, depending on whether the hole above one's head had been patched properly. Winter mornings required more coordination. Extra wood needed. Hauling boots took longer to thaw. Fingers refused to grip anything until coaxed back to life near the fire. A person could spend 20 minutes trying to tie a shoelace while swearing softly at frost. And fate gloves existed, but rarely matched, and often resembled two mittens that had recently escaped a compost pile. The morning passed without pause. There was no mid-morning tea, no second breakfast, and certainly no time to sit and contemplate the meaning of one's chores. One simply worked. Until the sun shifted, children might sneak a bite of something while pretending to look busy. Adults muttered through task lists. Only they could decipher. Elders provided commentary from whatever seat had the best view and the least exposure to drafts. If a visitor arrived early, it disrupted everything. Hosts scrambled to look as though they had been prepared. A cloth was thrown over something, a chair was offered. If the visitor brought news, it was usually bad. If they brought nothing, they stayed too long. Hospitality was sacred, but patience was mortal. Noise rose gradually. Hammers struck wood, hooves clattered. Someone shouted that the bucket had split again. The rhythm of daily life grew steadier, louder, and more absurd in the midst of it all. Someone always asked where the other shoe had gone. It had not gone anywhere. It was under the cloak next to the spoon. The first hour after waking was not magical. It was cold, loud, and crowded, but it was also ordinary, and that made it tolerable when everything was unpredictable. Weather, crops, illness, goats. A predictable morning was a kind of gift. No ribbons, no music, just breath in of cold air, and the knowledge that the fire was still burning, and in the corner of the room, Someone quietly banked a small ember for the next night because it would come again, because the same motions would be needed again, and because even the most exhausted hands knew the shape of survival. By late morning, the village was fully awake when a creak meant a raider. A spirit. The mud had thickened, the smoke had settled, the chickens were now trespassing confidently across property lines, and someone somewhere was already shouting about it. The day had found its rhythm, and that rhythm involved more repetition than innovation. This was the part of the day where tasks stopped being interesting and started being necessary. Fields had to be tended, fences had to be fixed, cloth needed mending, carts needed wheel checks, and no one seemed to know what had happened to the soapstone again. Everyone had work, and everyone knew exactly how much of it they would rather not be doing in agricultural households. The work focused on survival by way of dirt digging, sowing, weeding, turning compost, carrying manure from one corner of the world to another with a kind of grim dedication that only centuries of repetition could produce. Hands blistered, backs ached, shoes squelched. Occasionally someone muttered about becoming a monk. Children had their own assignments. Not formal jobs, but clusters of small responsibilities delivered with an implied threat. Watching geese gathering firewood, carrying water without dropping it, fetching things from the neighbor's barn without being distracted by whatever scandal was currently unfolding there. Children were both useful and unreliable, capable of real help, and also completely derailed by shiny rocks, spinning and weaving. Dominated female labor in many homes, especially outside planting and harvest seasons. The household spindle, rarely rested thread, was drawn and twisted with a rhythm as old as myth. It was not glamorous. It was not optional. Cloth needed to be made, and even the roughest garments required hours of preparation if the result resembled something wearable that was called success. In some households, a second fire was lit closer to midday to heat water for washing clothes or bodies washing. Either was an act of courage. Water was cold, soap, when it existed, was harsh, and privacy was aspirational at best. People washed quickly, strategically, and with the sort of discretion that came from years of pretending the curtain actually worked. Tradespeople set out into towns or long roads with tools and samples. The blacksmith needed commissions. The potter needed customers. The thatcher needed someone with a roof on the verge of collapse and poor impulse control. These interactions were brief. Coins were counted twice. Work was promised. Reputation carried more weight than ink in rural settings. News traveled slowly, but gossip sprinted a goat that. Escaped yesterday was already being described today as a devil in the form of livestock. Someone's car broke in a ditch, and by noon it had become a tale involving sabotage, divine punishment, and possibly a haunting oral tradition worked fast, especially when the truth was inconvenient. Lunch was not a pause, it was an overlap. People ate while working or standing or walking. More bread, a few greens, maybe some leftover stew from the night before, now congealed into something that could legally be called a wall. Ale washed it down. Talking occurred, but mostly in fragments and with full mouths. Among the elderly, the middle part of the day brought reflection or commentary. One sat, one muttered, one pointed at a crack in the wall and began a story no one asked for. It was not disrespect. It was ambient wisdom, background sound that filled the silence between hoofbeats and hammer strikes. Fringe beliefs thrived in this part of the day when the sun was high and odd occurrences could be seen clearly in some areas. It was believed that if a bird landed on a windowsill during midday, it carried a message. This message was really good: death, illness, or marriage, none of which people particularly wanted that week in monasteries. Late morning and early afternoon followed a different order. Bells marked the passing hours. Psalms were sung, pages turned in the scriptorium quills, scratched across vellum with the seriousness of 1,000 unpaid interns. Every letter mattered. Every blot was a setback. Discipline and ink ruled the day, and elbows were never allowed on the desk in towns. Noise ruled the streets. Vendors called out apprentices. Fumbled deliveries. Bakers adjusted loaves in ovens while pretending to remember which ones belonged to which customer. The air carried the scent of yeast, sweat, and whatever someone had spilled in the alley. A cart broke a wheel, a dog stole a sausage, a child claimed innocence. The pattern repeated. One fringe trade that emerged in this time was known as the bone collector knot. Metaphorical, actual bones cleaned, sorted, and repurposed for buttons, tools, or sometimes mysterious art projects that everyone agreed not to ask about. These tradespeople roamed the outskirts of towns, pulling useful fragments from places no one wanted to go. They were not popular, but they were necessary, like mold or tax collectors. Back in the countryside, weather continued to dictate the pace. Clouds rolled in. The wind shifted. Someone mentioned rain, with the same tone one might use to announce a siege. Laundry was rushed indoors. Tools were covered. Animals were rounded up. If nothing happened, complaints were issued about the forecast being unreliable. Children returned from errands with stories instead of items. A cat had chased a chicken. A neighbor had fallen in the stream. Someone claimed to have seen a ghost near the well. Again, adults nodded vaguely, impressed but still asked where the bucket was. The bucket had been forgotten, but the story would survive for weeks, tasks layered upon each other with a kind of mechanical inevitability. If the fence was fixed, the gate would need patching. If the herbs were gathered, they would need sorting. If the bucket was found, it would be leaking. Nothing ended. Everything continued. It was not so much a list as a spiral animal. Care filled the gaps. Pigs were fed. Sheep were counted. Chickens were accused of wrongdoing and denied it loudly. The rooster strutted as if responsible for all life, while ducks plotted their usual escape. No one trusted ducks. They were too quiet when they were planning something in many households. Afternoon also meant preparation for evening. Dough was needed for the night. Bread beans were sorted, herbs were dried and hung, candles were checked if wax was low. Someone would be sent to barter for more, armed with dried apples and false optimism. In wealthier homes, tutors arrived to instruct children in Latin manners and how not to embarrass their family lineage. Lessons were brief, often interrupted by chickens, and concluded with the tutor wondering whether this had all been a mistake. Children, as always, learned best by eavesdropping in the fields. Workers moved in patterns that defied the clock but made perfect sense to their bodies. A rhythm emerged. Scythe bundle stack, repeat in vineyards. Clusters were picked with fingers stained and knuckles scratched. No one called it sacred. They called it work. A few believed that if a horse sneezed precisely at noon, it foretold company by sunset. This prophecy was neither reliable nor helpful, but it gave people something to argue about when the horse was clearly just allergic to hay. Nevertheless, if someone did arrive, the horse was praised for its mysterious wisdom. Eventually, carts returned, wood was unloaded, tools were stored, boots were stomped at the threshold. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to pull the day toward its end. People straightened their backs, wiped hands on aprons, and stared briefly at the sky, wondering whether they had accomplished anything at all. They just could not tell, because everything still looked exactly the same. Afternoon slid into evening stories and whistling warnings as with the stealth of a fox, or perhaps just with the weight of another endless day. The sky shifted, hue the wind grew lazy, shadows stretched as if reaching for some excuse to end the day early. No one announced that evening had begun, but everyone recognized the signs. Tools were leaned against walls, aprons were shaken out. Someone finally remembered the bucket. The rhythm of the village slowed, but did not stop. It merely changed tempo. This was the hour of preparation for cessation. The world did not rest yet, but it began looking for a bench. Evening brought its own series of labors, mostly indoors. The outdoor tasks had dwindled with the light, but indoors there remained plenty to do. A stew needed tending, a cloth needed patching. A sibling dispute over who had ruined the firewood pile needed judging. No one admitted guilt, and no one was innocent for. Many families, this was the time for second chores. Those odd duties that had no obvious place in the rest of the day, replacing the rushes on the floor, sharpening a tool, peering at a hinge, and pretending one understood hinges. Someone might suddenly remember that the door had not latched properly for 6 months and declare it a crisis. It would not be fixed, but it would be discussed in wealthier homes. The shift was marked with ceremony. Candles were lit, robes were changed, tables were laid with bread cheese, something pickled, and an air of mild formality. Guests, if present, were expected to comment on the flavor of the bread, even if the bread had no flavor beyond slightly burned among peasants. The line between evening and night was thinner. Dinner was served from the same pot that had held lunch. The table, if one existed, was not cleared, merely nudged to one side to make space for feet. Children gathered near the hearth. Elders stayed seated where they had been all afternoon, unwilling to shift. A bone that had finally stopped aching. The food itself was not glamorous. Pottage, hard bread, maybe onions, always a suspicion that someone had added turnip again despite repeated protests. Everyone ate. No one applauded. The meal ended when the pot was empty or someone yelled about it being bedtime. That was the cue. Evening was a time of overlap, work and rest, light and dark, noise and hush. It was also when conversation long withheld attempted to stretch its legs. People spoke more freely, not loudly. Not about feelings, but about tools, whether and who had been seen limping near the tavern. Someone always had a theory, and someone else always had a reason why that theory was nonsense. This was the hour when stories returned, cautionary tales, family legends, descriptions of dreams that had made no sense but had somehow involved fire geese and a distant uncle. These were shared quietly near the hearth. The fire snapped, the dog twitched. A child fell asleep mid-sentence and was gently covered with whatever. Fabric was not currently in use. Some homes performed small rituals at this time. A coin hidden under the threshold, a prayer said toward the east, a broom placed bristles up to keep misfortune from entering. These actions were not questioned. They were repeated like breathing, not because they always worked, but because skipping them felt like inviting trouble in areas near forests. It was common to bar the door more than once, not because of wolves, although wolves were a possibility, but because night belonged to other things. Spirits, thieves, wind that whispered too deliberately. Doors were secured, shutters closed, and any open gap stuffed with cloth, or failing that, with passive hope washing occurred. If there was time and water, faces and hands, mostly feet. If one had been lucky enough to avoid mud, anything more was considered extravagant. Hair was combed but never discussed. No one boasted about personal grooming. If someone looked clean, it was attributed to lighting. Evening was also when minor repairs took place. The spindle was checked, the knife was honed, a bucket was turned upside down and stared at until someone remembered why it was leaking. The leaking was not fixed, but the memory was satisfying. One had identified the problem progress. The 4x was the central figure in the room. It lit everything, it warmed everything, it listened to everything and interrupted. No one. People faced it instinctively like plants turning toward the sun. The fire knew who had complained about dinner, and it forgave everyone. Some households had a special stone heated near the hearth and placed under the bed. It did not stay warm for long, but for those first 5 minutes, it was magic. Others relied on furs or the warmth of proximity. Sleep was not about comfort. It was about warmth, habit. And whoever claimed the best corner first evening sounds were different. The creak of wood, the settling of walls, the sigh of straw shifting under weight. Sometimes a barn door thudded in the wind, sometimes a chicken made a poor decision. People listened not with alarm, but with familiarity. These were the expected complaints of a structure that had survived another day. One fringe belief found in certain areas claimed that whistling indoors after dark invited misfortune. Specifically, it attracted wandering spirits, jealous ghosts, or bored ancestors. Whether this was true mattered less than the fact that no one wanted to test it. Whistling after dinner was considered unwise unless one truly disliked everyone in the room. For children, this was when energy surged for no reason. One began building something with sticks. Another declared they had seen a rat or a rat in a dream. Parents intervened with efficiency, redirecting chaos with threats, bribes, or a sudden assignment to rearrange the firewood outside the sky. Turned iron stars appeared reluctantly. The moon, if present, was greeted with suspicion or awe depending on its size and color. Owls called dogs answered. Somewhere down the lane, someone began singing off-key and was quickly encouraged to stop by the collective will of everyone with ears. Inside, the pace slowed, voices dropped, movements softened. No one declared bedtime, but it became apparent the youngest fell asleep first. Then the dog, then the middle child, who had spent the afternoon chasing geese adults, lingered a few, poked at the fire. One last time, someone set aside their spindle. Someone adjusted a blanket. Evening was not an ending, it was a narrowing. The room shrank. The world outside disappeared behind shutters. People leaned into the space around them. The day had been long. The next one would be longer. But for now, the air was still. The fire was low, and someone finally remembered to put the bucket out. Set in some parts of the countryside, families would quietly sing short evening songs, not ballads or hymns. Just a few lines repeated under breath while brushing hands against fabric. These songs had no known author. They were passed down like spoons or burn scars. The words did not matter. The melody mattered. It made the room feel slightly less like a roofed box and slightly more like home. The final duties were often the most sacred. A latch checked one more time. A glance at the sky, a quiet promise made to oneself to do better. Tomorrow, sharpen the blade, feed the chickens earlier. scold fewer at children, or at least remember to patch that hole in the wall. These were promises with poor track records, but making them helped. Some elders said the fire should never be allowed to die completely overnight, even in summer. It was not superstition, it was strategy, relighting. From nothing was hard, frustrating, and humiliating. If the neighbor was involved, embers were banked under ash, a stick was set beside the hearth, a plan was made. By the time sleep approached, no one bothered to say anything poetic, no one looked around and offered a speech about gratitude. People simply lay down, not because they had finished, but because they had paused. That was enough. Night in the 1300s did not fall. Beds crammed with elbows and old beliefs. It gathered slowly, deliberately, like a thick cloak, being draped across the landscape. The last smudge of light faded behind crooked rooftops, and the world surrendered itself to flickering hearth, guttering candles, and the kind of darkness that made every sound feel closer than it ought to be. This was not the hour of action. It was the hour of adjustment. The tasks were over. The chatter had dulled, and most limbs had accepted defeat. A few remained upright, poking at embers, folding wool, or brushing crumbs off a bench. But for the majority, this was the time to lie down, stare into nothing, and ignore the argument unfolding between two mice under the cupboard. In most homes, sleeping arrangements were not strategic. They were inevitable. Families slept together, often in the same bed, sometimes on straw mattresses laid in sequence like livestock puzzles. The idea of personal space did not exist. If someone shifted, everyone noticed. If someone snored, everyone judged. Silently, elbows were shared blankets. Where not positioning mattered, those closest to the fire were considered fortunate, unless the fire sparked, in which case they were considered flammable. The outermost sleeper risked exposure to cold drafts, animal paws, or sudden questions from children with active imaginations. Parents developed a sixth sense for incoming limbs. One eye remained half open. Out of habit of pillows were rare and inconsistent. A folded cloak, a sack of something soft adjacent. Occasionally a pet with poor boundaries. Beds were straw-stuffed sacks, wood platforms, or simply a tightly packed corner. Wealthier families might possess a proper frame complete with ropes that needed tightening. Hence the phrase about sleeping tight. It was more chore than luxury. Silence took time to settle. Someone always remembered one more thing, usually a complaint or a riddle. Then came the shuffles, the groans, the reminder that feet should not be placed against one sibling's spine. Eventually, the noise thinned. Breathing deepened, shadows lengthened. The house began to hold its breath. In the larger towns, night activity did not cease entirely. Inns remained open, lanterns swung from doorposts. Watchmen patrolled with staffs and half-bored expressions. The distant sound of a lute might drift through alleyways, followed by equally distant shouting. Somewhere someone knocked over something made of clay. No one cleaned it up for those still awake. Night offered a strange clarity. The dark removed distraction. It narrowed vision. A person could sit near the coals, stare at nothing, and feel as though they had solved something without knowing the question. This sensation lasted until someone sneezed or the dog twitched violently in its sleep. Certain beliefs were tied to the middle of the night. Some feared dreams that occurred past midnight, believing them to carry heavier meaning. Others welcomed them, claiming these were the dreams in which ancestors whispered warnings or recipes. Dream interpretation was a thriving household sport, second only to arguing over whose turn it was to empty the chamber pot among the nobility. Sleep rituals had their own flair. Tapestries were drawn, cushions fluffed, curtains closed. Bedchambers were cooled or warm, depending on the season. Servants. Whispered dogs lounged at the foot of the bed. With the self-importance of furniture, books were read aloud until the reader slurred into slumber. For peasants, the evening's pageantry involved, hoping no one kicked over the water bucket in the dark. Everything else was left where it had been dropped. If someone woke up thirsty, they drank from the same jug as everyone else. If someone needed the latrine, they tried not to wake the household or the goats. Usually one or the other objected. There was little privacy, but there was shared stillness when everything else had quieted. No tools, no shouting, no demands. There was space for thoughts to become almost audible. People remembered odd things at this hour, the way someone had looked at. Mark at the moment a cartwheel had grown louder than expected, the face of a sibling long gone, or the exact place they had hidden last summers. Some whispered prayers. Some counted the number of cracks in the ceiling. Some simply watched the flickering light on the wall and waited for dreams. There was no pressure to fall asleep quickly. Time no longer moved on a schedule. It meandered, it floated like smoke from the last burning stick. One fringe belief advised against sleeping with both hands above the blankets. It was said to invite the attention of witches who mistook it for an invitation to meddle. Others insisted that iron placed beneath the bed warded off nightmares, toothaches, or ungrateful spirits. Whether these rituals worked was irrelevant. People practiced them because one never wanted to be the exception. On a cursed morning, coughs echoed more loudly at night. So did whispers. So did creaks. If a child cried, someone reached out and patted the air until they found the right head. If an adult groaned, no one asked questions, unless it continued for more than 2 nights. Repeating discomfort meant trouble. Single-night groans were simply part of the ambience in monasteries. The night hours were marked by bells and chanting. The monks rose at odd intervals for prayers, psalms, and reflections. They walked softly. They spoke rarely. Their nights were regimented, sacred, and filled with candlelight, while the rest of the world slept through its aches. These figures drifted like ghosts through stone corridors, chasing spiritual clarity and warmth from insufficient wool. Back in the common home, night thickened, the fire dimmed to embers. Every shift in bedding released a puff of straw or a muttered curse. Someone dreamed aloud about turnips. Someone else muttered about chickens. No one responded. It was not always a peaceful rest. The second sleep had its own troubles. The air was colder. The dreams were stranger. Rats were more confident. A squeak in the corner could cause 3 people to sit up and argue whether it was a rat, a ghost, or a rat with ghost-like intentions. Eventually, they all gave up and pulled the blankets higher. Some families kept a candle lit all night, its flame no bigger than a bee's sigh. Others relied on the glow of coals or the light of the moon. Night was not completely dark. It was layered. Light came in threads. It slipped through cracks and under doors. It traced silhouettes on faces too tired to notice. In some regions, it was common to wake up fully during the night, sometimes for an hour or 2. This was not insomnia. It was just how things were. Historians now refer to this as segmented sleep, a first and second phase with a quiet wakefulness between them. People prayed, stirred the fire, or chatted in low voices. Some even visited neighbors, which feels ambitious for people in nightgowns. Others used the interval to think, to write, or to carve a spoon. Spoon carving at 2 a.m. was not considered eccentric. It was considered productive in some homes. It was also when minor confessions happened. The quiet dark seemed more forgiving. A broken tool, a forgotten chore, a slightly exaggerated story about the size of a fish all came out before the second sleep. In this suspended quiet, thoughts became their own kind of visitors. Hopes, regrets, small plans for tomorrow, whether to mend the sock or let it die. Whether the geese had forgiven the incident near the pond, whether the neighbor's son had truly fallen in love or just wanted free pie. These were not heavy thoughts, just soft ones. And somewhere between breath and murmur, night held the house. No matter how cold the room or how cramped the bed, there was something undeniably human in this moment of shared stillness. No one was alone, everyone was horizontal. The world had narrowed to the size of a single room. A few bodies, and the promise that morning would come again, the second sleep once it returned. The return of sleep and the whisper of dawn came slower and quieter. There was no official moment when it began. It simply crept in, a hand that had been scratching the blanket, stopped mid-motion, a breath deepened, a fire shifted in its ashes without commentary. One by one, the minds in the room drifted from the world into whatever world sleep still had to offer. The hours between second sleep and dawn were the coldest. Even in summer, a chill settled over everything. Roofs trapped the night air. Walls held shadows. Two long beds, if one could call them that, became negotiations between warmth and splinters. Anyone waking during this stretch did so with a groan, and a prayer for blankets to have grown overnight outside the village was as silent as it ever became, not truly quiet. Nothing ever was, but deeply muffled wind threaded between chimneys. A distant dog gave up its vigilance halfway through a bark. Somewhere an owl questioned a mouse's life decisions. In this murky stillness, time felt detached, floating like breath across frozen glass. In households across Europe, segmented sleep was understood without explanation. Waking in the middle of the night was normal, even expected. There were no bedside clocks to provoke panic, no sense that one had failed to sleep properly. The interruption was used. People prayed, meditated, or listened to the sounds of the house. It was not disruption, it was simply pause. In some communities, it was believed that waking during this time granted one a sliver of divine awareness, that the body, no longer burdened by motion or noise, became a better vessel for insight. Not that anyone expected full enlightenment while wrapped in wool and pressed between three siblings. But still, one could hope others used the time. Practically embers were stirred, the fire reawakened with the gentleness of habit. A drink of water was taken from a clay jug that had never truly been clean. A child was tucked back under a blanket. A dog was gently removed from someone's head. These tasks were not urgent. They were offered to the dark as a way of saying, yes, we are still here. There were also those who slipped outside, quietly, without fanfare. A quick moment beneath the stars, or in the privy, or by the barn where the ox had been coughing. This was not adventure. It was necessity. But it was also the only time a person might be entirely alone. If only for a minute, the sky, black and immense, asked no questions. The cold air reset. Whatever had been wrong with the evening dreams during second sleep were different, stranger, longer, less connected to the ordinary complaints of the day. People remembered them with more clarity, though often less logic. Dreams of flying geese in church robes of neighbors who had become root vegetables of impossible staircases guarded by cats that spoke Latin. No one questioned these dreams. They were not entertainment. They were night's way of continuing the conversation as dawn approached. Home stirred again, though reluctantly it began with the fire or the lack of it. Someone noticed the cold. Someone else coughed. A third person tried to fake continued sleep, but failed when their foot was kicked slowly without joy. Or music bodies reassembled into people. The second waking had begun. This second waking differed from the first. It was not as sharp, less immediate. The body moved out of obligation. Not surprise, eyes stayed closed. Longer, limbs stretched as if unsure they belonged to their owner. The smell of last night's stew still lingered in the air, mixed with smoke and something no one wanted to identify. The fire was coaxed back to life. If the embers had survived, it was seen as a triumph. If they had not, the youngest person was sent out to borrow flame from a neighbor again. This was met with groans and the occasional philosophical monologue about the unfairness of life delivered while putting on a damp cloak. Clothing was reassembled, not changed. No one changed anything unless absolutely required. But adjusted belts, retightened laces, reknotted cloaks reflung across shoulders. If a hole had grown larger overnight, it was now acknowledged. If socks were missing, they were declared, cursed, and replaced with hope. One tradition common in several regions involved mumbling a charm or blessing upon the second, waking nothing dramatic. Just a small rhyme to protect the household from accidents during the day. No slip, no spill, no burn, no break, or its local equivalent said. To no one in particular, a little protection against splinters, spilled water, or sudden geese. Animals woke as well. Chickens rustled, cows snorted, dogs already awake, but pretending otherwise stretched with great drama. The barn called, the fields waited. The air smelled like expectations and unfinished work, and still most people lingered just a little longer by the hearth, waiting for the heat to confirm their choices. The second waking was not universally acknowledged. Some homes rose in a single stretch, pretending the night had passed without interruption, but most accepted the gap between sleeps as simply part of the rhythm. One did not comment on it. One simply folded it into the day like salt into dough prison. Invisible, necessary. In towns, the first echoes of morning began during this phase. A bell might toll from a distant chapel. A cart might creak across cobbles. Someone lit a lamp too early, and someone else muttered that it was too soon. The city began to breathe slowly like a giant made of mud and gossip among monks. The approach of morning was marked with matins, the final set of prayers in a long night of vigilance. Candles flickered in stone halls, psalms echoed off walls, sandals shuffled. The world turned quietly from darkness toward light, helped along by sacred whispers and cold fingers in the villages. The light returned grudgingly. First a grayness, then the hint of shape in the outline of the shutters, then the realization that someone had again left the tools out, and that a chicken had somehow ended up in the house. No one celebrated dawn. It was simply noted, filed away. Dreams faded, night retreated. People began sorting their thoughts into useful and useless piles. What needed doing what? could be ignored, who would pretend not to hear the first request to fetch water. These were questions of survival disguised as routine. Not every home resumed at the same pace. Some rose like bread in a cold oven. Slow, lumpy, and vaguely resentful, others snapped into motion, driven by habit hunger or the need to reach market before all the good eggs were gone. But regardless of pace, the day began again. One fringe belief warned against stepping out of bed with the left foot, first claiming it invited a crooked day, bad weather, sour milk, and clumsy fingers a few. Followed this rule with superstitious care. Others stepped out any way they pleased and blamed fate when they dropped something either way. The day got blamed for whatever happened next. Water was fetched, not a chore so much as a pilgrimage. The path to the well was sacred and mildly hazardous. Mud goats and nosy neighbors guarded it. The water itself was never cold enough or clean enough, but it was all that existed. Someone always spilled a little, and someone else always complained that they had bread from the night before was reheated near the hearth, or not reheated. Sometimes it was just chewed with the determination of someone pretending not to have teeth issues. A bit of cheese might be sliced. A few herbs crushed into a drink that claimed to be medicinal. No one asked what it was supposed to cure, only that it be warm. A rooster crowed. No one thanked it. Everyone noticed. Some rolled their eyes. Some silently debated whether it was time to replace the rooster. That conversation never ended. Roosters were immortal in opinion, if not in lifespan. The house filled with motion. Slow motion, people stepping around each other, patching clothes, wiping faces, complaining about nothing with the energy of people avoiding real tasks. The dog barked at its own shadow. A pot fell and someone shouted dramatically. Though no one responded, it was morning. And through all of it, the space left behind by the second sleep faded. The night retreated fully. Life stood up, shook off its straw, and tried again. Back to chores, geese, and forgetting the bucket. Morning light had fully arrived, though no one had requested it. The house, already awake in motion, if not in spirit, now leaned into its duties with the reluctant enthusiasm of people who had accepted their fates. There were no trumpets. There was no ceremonial welcome for the sun. It simply appeared through the shutters, and everyone pretended it had not caught them. Yawning, tasks resumed with a sense of inevitability rather than inspiration. The fire was restoked. Ashes were scooped and muttered over porridge. If available, was reheated and made only marginally more edible by adding whatever survived the pantry's winter. This might include dried berries, honey, or the eternal optimism that hunger would disguise. Taste. Children were given instructions, most of which were ignored. A request to carry water became a philosophical inquiry about why water was heavy. A command to sweep the floor was met with a discussion on whether sweeping before or after the porridge mattered. These debates ended only when a wooden spoon was raised, not in violence, but in symbolic authority. Adults returned to their stations in the field, if the season allowed. In the barn, always wool needed carting tools, needed checking something, smelled like it should not be ignored. A hen was missing again, and somewhere out of sight but not out of mind, someone had forgotten the bucket. The sounds of the village formed a tapestry. Hooves clapped past gates. A hammer rang out from the farrier shed. Voices drifted from garden fences. Chickens protested decisions they did not understand. A dog barked at a passing cloud. Life was not coordinated, but it was synchronized, everyone moving in overlapping circles, each unaware of the others. But part of the same slow machinery. One family argued about a missing cloak. Another discovered that their door had swollen shut. A third spent 15 minutes discussing whether the neighbor's goose looked suspicious. The news cycle had begun. Breakfasts were modest. The second meal of the day, if it happened, depended on the first if one ate well. Upon waking, then the midday pause might be light. A crust of bread, a sliver of salted meat, or a bite of whatever had not been claimed by mold. If one had skipped early food due to distractions or an optimistic goat, then midday became more important. Weather dictated all ambition. A sunny morning might tempt someone into optimism. Rain crushed dreams before they left the threshold. Wind was greeted with muttered suspicions and sudden decisions to postpone anything involving ladders. The sky had more authority than the village elder in wealthier households. Breakfast arrived in courses, bread with jam, a soft cheese, a warm drink of ale, or spiced milk. Servants moved like practiced shadows. No one made eye contact until at least the third course. Conversation was permitted only after the family patriarch had sighed deeply and declared the day tolerable amongst monks. Breakfast was simple and silent, a bit of bread, perhaps some dried fruit, and a routine that reminded everyone that food was not for pleasure but fuel. Every bite was chewed with awareness. Every swallow echoed within stone walls. Even burps were considered theological statements. If delivered at the wrong time, among the common folk, breakfast was as quick as it was forgettable. There was too much to do. The pigs did not wait. The barley field did not weed itself. The goats continued to defy containment. One could not explain to a goat that one was finishing breakfast. A goat simply left. One mainstream detail that scholars now agree upon is the repetition of daily patterns. The structure of these rural mornings changed little across the decades. The tools changed shape. The barns leaned differently, but the cycle of waking, working, feeding, and forgetting stayed consistent. The rhythm was not optional. It was the only melody most people knew. That consistency did not mean it was easy. There were always setbacks. A sick animal, a broken tool, a neighbor with urgent complaints about imaginary property lines. The entire day could be undone by a single loose hinge or a stone in the wrong boot. People adapted not by solving problems, but by accepting them as permanent guests. One fringe belief, mostly found in northern areas, warned that speaking too loudly before the church bell rang would startle the day, causing mishaps. Some families practiced morning whispering with religious fervor. Others forgot, and then explained stubbed toes or spilled porridge as divine punishment. It was never the fault of the furniture. By late morning, the house began to breathe differently. Beds were cleared of straw. Blankets were hung to air out. Chamber pots were emptied without applause. Laundry was considered then postponed if it had not been washed yet. It probably did not need washing today either. This was logic, not laziness. Children returned from early chores with elaborate explanations. The geese had rebelled. The path to the well had disappeared. Someone had tried to carry a stick and lost a shoe. Adults listened with the patience of people who had once done the same and responded with vague encouragement or threats. To reassign tasks, the elderly had found their rhythm as well. Some sat by the window and offered commentary on the weather, which was helpful because everyone else could also see the weather. Some recounted stories that involved barns, storms, or vegetables behaving strangely. These tales were neither useful nor accurate, but they were comforting. The house was no longer sleepy. It was firmly awake. The air inside smelled of smoke, wool, and effort. Outside, the sun hovered with intent, as if daring someone to take a break. No one accepted the dare. There was still too much to do. Straw beds were shaken and restuffed. Firewood was stacked into patterns that only made sense to the person stacking them. Salt was checked because running out meant social collapse. If there was a moment to rest, it was taken while pretending to inspect a tool. One sat wiped a brow and muttered about the alignment of the moon. It was during this stretch that people prepared for the evening without realizing it. Dough was started, beans were soaked, herbs were chopped with vague guesses about their identities. What was edible and what was mildly poisonous lived side by side in the same bowl. Luck again played its usual role in dinner. Someone asked if the neighbor's goat had been seen. Someone else answered yes, but the answer was not convincing. Goats did not respect boundaries or schedules. If one appeared in the field unannounced, no one was surprised if it spoke Latin. Some would raise an eyebrow but still not intervene. By now, most homes had hit their peak energy. The work had fully resumed. Conversations had faded into grunts. The village buzzed, not with news, but with noise. The hammer, the bucket, the scolded child, the disgruntled sheep, every home its own orchestra of necessary friction. There were signs, subtle ones, that the rhythm of the day would soon begin to tilt again. A glance at the sky, the tightening of a cloak, a sheep returning without fanfare, the suggestion unspoken that perhaps everything that needed doing had been attempted, and most of it had failed in charmingly predictable ways. The midday meal, if there was one, depended on fortune. A bit of bread, reheated against stone, a handful of herbs tossed with vinegar, and hope-cold porridge that had grown more philosophical than edible. If someone had visited market, there might be pickled fish. If someone had not, there was always complaining. Time crept forward. There was no clock to argue with. Only the light shadows grew stouter, chickens grew louder. Somewhere a child declared it was still morning and was met with a silence so profound it became law. The afternoon approached, and beneath all of it, the knowledge that night would come again, that the beds would be repopulated, that someone would forget to close the shutters and someone else would dream of flying turnips. Life was repetition, but it was also rhythm, and rhythm, when done well, began to feel like peace. The village had quieted again, not fully and not forever. A soft fade into the firelight, but enough for stillness to reclaim a corner of the day. The fire had been banked. The tools had been returned to their places, though not always the correct ones. The air smelled like cooling bread, smoldering ash, and earth that had finally released its warmth. It was not night yet, but it was no longer afternoon. Inside the homes, voices dropped in pitch. Conversations trailed off, mid-thought replaced by gestures, shrugs, and the kind of silence that grows out of familiarity rather than discomfort. No one announced that the day was ending. No one needed to. People moved more slowly. They lingered longer by the fire. Someone adjusted the shutters just enough to let in the fading light without admitting the breeze. The floor had been swept, the stew had been stirred. A child had been scolded for a reason no one remembered. The blanket was where it belonged again. The bucket mercifully had been found outside the sky, softened into its final colors, pale roses smudged blue, a hint of rust like iron left in the rain. Birds that had spent the day shouting their existence from rooftops. Now whispered it from tree branches. A single cart creaked in the distance, its wheels arguing gently with the road. The wind no longer carried urgency. It carried hints of hay, chimney smoke, and someone's idea of supper. Evening in the village was not dramatic. It did not arrive with bells or music. It arrived the way a familiar blanket does, quietly, comfortably. And with a few loose threads, the shadows stretched, the dog yawned. Someone took off their shoes and did not put them away inside. The last meal of the day was being eaten, or had already disappeared. It was rarely celebratory. Often it was simply hot bread dipped into broth, a piece of cheese that had survived the week. Whatever was edible, manageable, and unlikely to provoke complaints louder than a sigh. Afterward, the bowls were not scrubbed so much as acknowledged. With water, hands were dried on aprons that had known better days. Someone folded something, someone else unfolded it again by mistake. The hearth became the room's anchor. Even if the fire had dimmed to a whisper, it was in this pause, this gentle exhale of a day, that sleep began to creep in, not immediately, and not all at once. First, in the posture of the people around the fire, then in the slowness of their sentences, then in the way one person blinked too long and another stopped pretending to be interested in the mending pile. There was a comfort in the repetition. The same words said, the same questions asked, the same responses given with slightly different sarcasm. Someone always said the weather was changing. Someone else always disagreed. These rituals mattered not for their content, but for their presence. They made the evening real. Children were the first to drift, though never willingly, they claimed. They were wide awake, even as their heads tilted forward. A gentle nudge, a murmur, a tug of the blanket, and they were gone, curled against someone's side, breathing like tiny bellows in the dimness. Elders followed next, not into full sleep, but into that waiting place where memory and rest shake hands. Their eyes stayed open, their fingers stayed busy with string or fabric, but their minds had already stepped sideways into older stories and quieter rooms. And then came the fire watchers, the last few to sleep, the ones who poked at coals, adjusted logs, and made sure that something would still be glowing in the morning. These were not insomniacs. They were guardians of habit, stewards of the ember. They stayed not out of worry, but because someone always had. Outside, the stars were arranging themselves with quiet determination. The moon, fat or thin, judgmental or indifferent, hovered in her accustomed place somewhere in the distance. An owl declared its territory, and a fox considered the morality of stealing. Eggs inside the room had hushed, breathing, deepened blankets, shifted, the fire exhaled. Someone murmured a final word, half dream, half prayer. There was no need to respond. Everything that needed saying had already been said, and what had not would wait until morning. And so the day ended, not with a moment of significance, but with the familiar silence of people who had done enough, eaten enough, and heard enough geese for one lifetime. The house rested. The night returned to its watch, and the rhythm that had begun at dawn folded in on itself, ready to begin again.